The TV studio lights were bright, and the cameras were already rolling when Luca Rinaldi took his seat. He wore a simple dark suit, his posture straight, his face calm but serious. The program was a live news talk show, mostly focused on global affairs and religious news. Luca had once served as a Swiss guard at the Vatican, and tonight he was invited to share his thoughts about the newly elected Pope, Robert Prevost. The host smiled and introduced him quickly. Joining us tonight is Luca Rinaldi, a former member of the Swiss Guard who served under 3 different popes during his time at the Vatican. Luca nodded politely. "We understand you've had a unique experience with the new pope," the host continued. "Pope Robert Prevost. How is he different from others you've seen?" Luca didn't waste time. "This pope," he said, "is unlike anyone I've ever worked with." The host leaned forward, curious. "How so?" Luca glanced briefly at the camera. He remembers names, not just cardinals or bishops. He remembers the name of every guard, every cook, every cleaner. That might not seem like much, but in the Vatican, it's huge. The audience was quiet. Luca continued, "I remember the day he arrived as pope. Most popes walk past the guards without a word, maybe a nod. Pope Robert stopped. He looked at me directly and said, 'Thank you for your service, Luca.' I was shocked. I'd never even met him before." The host raised an eyebrow. "He knew your name." Luca nodded. "Exactly, and it wasn't just me. He did the same with many others. He makes you feel like a person, not just a uniform." The interview was only supposed to be a short segment, but the producers signaled to keep it going. People were clearly interested. The host smiled again. "That's impressive. Any other first impressions?" Luca thought for a moment. He doesn't act like he's above anyone. He walks around the Vatican like a regular priest. No fancy robes unless needed, no big speeches unless it matters. One evening, just days after he became pope, I saw him walking alone near the gardens. No security, no assistant, just him. I asked if everything was all right. He smiled and said, "I just needed some air, Luca." That's who he is. Honest. Simple. Real. The host looked surprised. "So you think he's going to change things?" Luca gave a small smile. "He already is." And somewhere in the middle of that quiet, powerful moment, the screen flashed a quick message. If you're enjoying these rare behind-the-scenes stories, don't forget to subscribe for more. The segment continued, but one thing was clear. The audience had just seen a different side of the Vatican, through the eyes of someone who had lived behind its walls, and more importantly, they were seeing a new kind of pope. Luca Rinaldi had served in the Swiss Guard for years, and he had met several popes during his time at the Vatican. But nothing had prepared him for his first encounter with Pope Robert Prevost. It was the day after the papal election, and the atmosphere in the Vatican was electric, filled with a mixture of excitement and anticipation. The guards were on high alert, ready for anything that might happen. Luca was standing near one of the side entrances when the new pope walked by. The moment was so ordinary, yet so unexpected. Pope Robert was not surrounded by a large entourage of cardinals or staff. He wasn't holding a grand procession or making any special appearances. Instead, he simply walked down the hall, his eyes scanning the faces of those who were there. When Pope Robert saw Luca standing by the door, he stopped. For a brief second, the air seemed to hold still. Pope Robert didn't just glance at Luca as most might. He walked right up to him, extended his hand, and said, "Thank you for your service, Luca. I'm honored to meet you." Luca froze. It wasn't just the unexpectedness of the encounter. It was the fact that the Pope had remembered his name. Luca had never spoken to Pope Robert before, and yet here he was, acknowledging him personally. "Your Holiness," Luca responded, feeling a bit overwhelmed. "It's an honor to meet you too." What struck Luca the most was the warmth in Pope Robert's voice. It wasn't the usual formal tone that one might expect from such a high figure in the church. It was genuine. It felt personal. The Pope didn't see him as just a Swiss guard in uniform. He saw him as an individual, as a person. This was different. "Are you doing well?" Pope Robert asked, still holding his hand out. "How's everything here in the Vatican?" Luca couldn't help but smile. "Everything is well, Your Holiness. The guards are ready and prepared for whatever comes next." Pope Robert nodded, looking satisfied with the answer. Good to hear. I've heard a lot of great things about the Swiss Guard. Keep up the good work. With that, Pope Robert gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder before continuing down the hall. The encounter lasted no more than a couple of minutes, but it left a lasting impression on Luca. It wasn't just the fact that the Pope knew his name, or that he had taken the time to ask about him. It was the way Pope Robert had made him feel, seen, valued, and important, even in the midst of a busy day filled with enormous responsibility. Luca stood there for a moment, watching the Pope disappear around the corner. The experience had already started to change his perception of what it meant to serve in the Vatican. Pope Robert wasn't just a leader on a throne. He was a person who cared, who understood, and who, most importantly, respected those around him. As Luca turned and made his way back to his post, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was late at night when the alarm blared through the Vatican. The sudden sound echoed down the halls, cutting through the quiet that had settled over the Vatican City. Luca Rinaldi, standing guard near the papal residence, immediately snapped into action. He had trained for years for moments like this, but nothing could truly prepare him for what was about to unfold. Luca checked his watch. It was just after midnight. He had been on duty for a few hours, but this was unlike any other shift he had worked. The alarm wasn't the usual drill or a false alarm. This time, there was something urgent. Something was happening. He grabbed his radio and spoke into it quickly. "This is Guard Rinaldi. We've got an alarm at the residence. Stand by for instructions." Before he could even finish his sentence, he noticed something unusual. A figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, moving quickly but quietly. At first, Luca thought it might be a staff member or a visitor who had gotten lost. But as the figure came closer, Luca's heart skipped a beat. It was Pope Robert. He was dressed simply in his white robes, no security in sight, no entourage following him. Just him, walking calmly toward the heart of the disturbance. Luca's first instinct was to stop him, to get him back to safety. The Pope was supposed to be protected, not out wandering in the middle of an emergency. "Your Holiness," Luca called out, quickly approaching. "You need to return to your quarters. There's a security situation. It's not safe out here." Pope Robert stopped, his calm expression never changing. "I know, Luca," he said softly. "I'm not worried. I want to see for myself. I want to make sure everything's all right." Luca hesitated. He had never encountered a pope quite like this before. Most popes would have been in their rooms by now, with guards surrounding them, waiting for the situation to be handled. But Pope Robert wasn't running away from danger. He wasn't hiding behind walls. He was walking straight into it. "You need to go back, Your Holiness," Luca insisted, his voice a little more urgent. "We can't take any chances." Pope Robert smiled and put a hand gently on Luca's arm. "Luca, I trust you, but I need to be here. I need to show my people that I'm not afraid, that we face things together." There was a pause. Luca knew what the Pope meant. This wasn't just about security, it was about leadership. Pope Robert was showing that he would stand with the people, not hide behind them. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from further down the corridor. Luca turned sharply, ready for anything. But it wasn't an intruder. It was a small group of guards, moving quickly to secure the area. Pope Robert nodded to them as they passed, still walking calmly alongside Luca. As they reached the central area of the residence, the situation was quickly resolved. It turned out to be a false alarm. A small electrical issue had triggered the security system, but it was nothing serious. As the guards moved to reset the system, Pope Robert turned to Luca. "Thank you for your work, Luca. I'm glad to know we're in good hands." Luca nodded, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't expected. The night had been chaotic, but Pope Robert had made it clear this was a leader who didn't just sit in the background during tough times. He faced them head-on, alongside his people. And in that moment, Luca realized just how different this pope truly was. The Vatican was a place of strict rules and traditions, a place where every move seemed carefully planned. But in the quiet hallways, far from the eyes of the cameras and visitors, rumors began to spread about Pope Robert Prevost. It started with whispers from the staff, murmurs shared in the break rooms or during late-night shifts. Something unusual was happening, but no one could quite put their finger on it. Luca Rinaldi had heard the stories. He wasn't sure if they were true, but the more he thought about them, the more certain he became that something was different about the new pope. It wasn't long before Luca himself began to notice signs. Pope Robert didn't follow the typical pattern most popes did. For instance, the guards had strict protocols about the pope's movements. He was always surrounded by staff, always accompanied by security. That was standard practice. But on a few occasions, Luca had noticed something strange. Pope Robert would slip out of the Vatican late at night, quietly, without anyone noticing. At first, Luca thought it was just his imagination. Maybe the Pope had a late-night meeting, or maybe he was just out for a walk. But then it happened again. One evening, long after the Vatican had quieted down, Luca was on duty near one of the side gates. It was his routine shift, watching for anything unusual. But as he stood there, he saw Pope Robert, dressed in plain clothes, walking calmly down the street outside the Vatican walls. Luca knew this wasn't normal. The Pope never left the Vatican grounds without a full security team. Yet here was Pope Robert, strolling along without anyone around. Luca watched from a distance, unsure what to do. He didn't want to interrupt or draw attention to him, but at the same time, he felt uneasy. The Pope's behavior was far from what Luca had been trained to expect. The next time it happened, Luca decided to follow. He was careful, making sure not to get too close, not to be noticed. He watched Pope Robert visit a small charity clinic on a quiet street corner in Rome. The clinic was a modest place, with little to no publicity. The Pope didn't make a big announcement or speak to reporters. He simply walked in, greeted the staff, and spent time talking with patients. There was no crowd, no fanfare, just Pope Robert's presence. He wanted to help, not for the cameras, but because it was the right thing to do. When Luca shared what he had seen with a fellow guard, his friend was shocked. "You're telling me the Pope goes out alone, without anyone knowing?" his friend asked. "That doesn't sound right." But Luca had no explanation. All he could do was shrug. "I don't know what to think. It's not how things usually work, but the Pope doesn't seem worried about it." As the rumors continued to grow, Luca began to realize that Pope Robert was different, not just in his actions, but in his mindset. The Pope didn't fear what others might think of him. He didn't cling to power or formality. Instead, he lived with a sense of humility, quietly working behind the scenes, away from the spotlight. The Vatican was a place full of secrets, and now, Pope Robert was adding to that mystery. Luca Rinaldi had seen many things during his time as a Swiss guard, but nothing had prepared him for the moments he would witness in the weeks after Pope Robert Prevost's election. The Pope's actions were increasingly surprising, especially considering how private he kept them. There were no grand speeches or media events. Instead, Pope Robert seemed to prefer doing things quietly, away from the public eye. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Luca found himself walking back to the barracks when he noticed something unusual. It was already past midnight, and the streets around the Vatican were calm. He had just passed the main gate when he saw a figure ahead of him. It was Pope Robert. He was walking along a narrow, quiet street in Rome, with only a small group of people accompanying him. No security, no entourage, just a handful of staff. It wasn't unusual for the Pope to take walks, but this time, Luca felt a strange sense of curiosity. Pope Robert wasn't heading toward any of the usual places. Instead, he was making his way to a small, unremarkable building tucked away in a corner of the city. Luca knew the building. It was a charity clinic that helped the homeless and people who couldn't afford proper medical care. The clinic wasn't well known, and it certainly didn't get much attention from the media. Yet here was Pope Robert, walking toward it with a calm, almost purposeful demeanor. Luca stayed in the shadows, not wanting to be seen, but also unsure of what to do. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to be witnessing this. The Pope didn't have any scheduled appearances at the clinic, and as far as Luca knew, no one was supposed to know about this visit. Pope Robert arrived at the clinic and knocked gently on the door. A few moments later, the door opened, and a nurse greeted him with surprise. Luca could hear their quiet conversation from where he stood, but he couldn't make out the words. After a brief exchange, the nurse stepped aside, allowing Pope Robert to enter. Luca waited, his curiosity getting the better of him. He knew it wasn't his place to follow the Pope into the clinic, but he couldn't help it. He stayed at a distance, observing through a nearby window. Inside, he could see Pope Robert sitting with a group of patients. The Pope wasn't giving a speech or offering grand words of advice. Instead, he was quietly listening to them, asking how they were feeling, what their needs were, and offering his support. There was something deeply personal about the scene. Pope Robert didn't seem concerned with appearances or formalities. He wasn't there to be seen or celebrated. He was there because he genuinely wanted to help. Luca watched for a while, feeling a mix of respect and awe. This wasn't a leader trying to make a public show of kindness. This was someone quietly making a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. Pope Robert didn't need the spotlight. His presence alone was enough. When the visit ended, Pope Robert left the clinic just as quietly as he had arrived. He waved goodbye to the staff, then disappeared into the night. Luca stayed where he was for a few moments, deep in thought. He realized that what he had just witnessed was far from an ordinary act. Pope Robert wasn't a man who cared about praise or recognition. He was simply doing what he felt was right. The visit to the charity clinic was a small private moment, but to Luca, it revealed something important. This was the kind of Pope Robert Prevost was: humble, caring, and dedicated to his people, even in the quietest ways. It had been a difficult week for Luca Rinaldi. He had received news that his grandmother, whom he had been close to all his life, had passed away. The loss was a heavy burden, and the grief weighed on him even as he continued his duties as a Swiss guard. He found it hard to focus, and some nights he struggled to keep his mind on his work, but he did his best to remain professional. After all, that was part of his job, to serve the Pope and the Vatican, no matter what. One morning, after finishing his shift, Luca returned to his barracks to find something unexpected. There was an envelope placed carefully on his bunk. It was simple, with no return address or markings, just his name written in neat handwriting. Luca frowned, wondering what it could be. At first, he assumed it might be a letter from one of his fellow guards or a note from the administration. But when he opened it, his eyes widened. It was a letter from Pope Robert Prevost. The letter wasn't long, but it was enough to stop Luca in his tracks. Pope Robert had written a few simple words that would change Luca's entire perspective on his role at the Vatican. "Luca, I know this has been a difficult time for you. I just wanted you to know that I am keeping you in my prayers. Remember, you are not alone. The service you give to the Church and the people is seen and appreciated. Your strength in times of sorrow is a testament to your character. May you find peace in this challenging moment. With warmth, Pope Robert Prevost." Luca sat down on his bunk, holding the letter tightly. He couldn't believe it. How did the Pope even know about his loss? The letter wasn't just a formal note of sympathy. It was personal. It showed an understanding of Luca's pain, an acknowledgement of his grief in a way that felt genuine. He had never expected something like this. In all his years of service to previous popes, Luca had never received anything more than the standard, impersonal gestures. But Pope Robert's letter was different. It felt like a true connection. One person reaching out to another in a time of need, without any distance or hierarchy. Luca read the letter again, his heart feeling a little lighter. It wasn't that the words were particularly grand or profound, but the sincerity behind them meant everything. The Pope hadn't just sent a message out of duty. He had taken the time to acknowledge a guard's personal loss, offering support and comfort. It was something that felt rare in the rigid world of the Vatican, where emotions were often hidden behind layers of formality. As Luca placed the letter down, he felt a new sense of purpose. The Pope's kindness had given him a renewed sense of strength. It reminded him that even in the midst of his own grief, he wasn't just a guard or an outsider to the Pope. He was part of something bigger, part of a community that cared. Luca stood up, taking a deep breath. The sadness still lingered, but the Pope's letter had reminded him that he wasn't alone. He wasn't just serving a leader. He was serving a man who saw, understood, and cared for the people around him. And that was something he would carry with him every day from that moment forward. It had been weeks since Luca Rinaldi received the letter from Pope Robert, and since then, his perspective on his role at the Vatican had shifted. No longer was he just a guard doing his duty. The Pope's personal message had reminded him that there was more to serving than simply standing watch. There was a deeper sense of connection, of purpose, that Luca hadn't fully realized until now. One evening, as he finished his shift, and was about to head back to his barracks, Luca was called to a meeting. It was rare for a Swiss guard to be summoned like this, especially after hours. The request came directly from Pope Robert's office, and Luca couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and nervousness. What could the Pope need at this hour? When he arrived at the private meeting room, Luca was greeted by a familiar face, one of the Pope's close aides. "The Holy Father would like to speak with you, Luca," the aide said. "Please, follow me." Luca's mind raced as he walked down the long corridor, trying to guess what might be happening. Was it about the security protocols? A new duty? Or perhaps something related to the ongoing whispers that had spread throughout the Vatican? Pope Robert had been making waves with his unconventional actions, and Luca had heard a lot of speculation about what the future might hold for the Church. When they reached the room, Luca was surprised to find Pope Robert alone, sitting at a small desk. The Pope was dressed in simple robes, his expression calm but serious. He stood up as Luca entered. "Luca, please sit," Pope Robert said, motioning to a chair in front of him. "I've asked you here tonight because there's something I need to discuss with you." Luca sat down, unsure of what to expect. Pope Robert didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been thinking a lot about how we serve, about the kind of leadership I want to bring to the Vatican, and I've come to a conclusion." He paused, looking at Luca directly. "I believe the role of the Swiss Guard is not just about protecting the Pope or the Vatican. It's about serving the people, showing them that we are here to protect their faith, their well-being, not just our own. That's why I want to offer you something." Luca leaned forward, his heart racing. What could the Pope possibly be offering him? "I've been considering making some changes to the way we approach security, the way we interact with the community. And I want you to be a part of it. I believe you can help lead this change." Pope Robert continued. "You've shown strength, compassion, and a sense of duty that goes beyond the uniform. I want you to take on a more active role, not just as a guard, but as a representative of the values I hold dear: humility, service, and care for the people. Will you accept this responsibility?" Luca sat in stunned silence for a moment. The offer was unexpected, and yet it felt right. He had always believed in the importance of his duty as a guard, but now he was being asked to be something more, someone who could help change the way the Vatican interacted with the world. I don't know what to say," Luca stammered. Pope Robert smiled gently. "You don't have to say anything yet, Luca. Just think about it. This is about serving in a way that's true to who we are, as people of faith, as leaders, and as individuals who want to make a difference." Luca nodded slowly. He felt the weight of the decision before him, but he also felt a new sense of purpose. Pope Robert wasn't just offering him a new position. He was offering him a chance to help transform the way the Vatican was perceived, to serve in a way that felt meaningful and impactful. "I'll think about it, Your Holiness," Luca said, his voice steady now. Pope Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take your time, Luca. I know you will make the right choice." As Luca left the room, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt before. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the Pope was offering him more than just a role. He was offering him the chance to help change the Vatican's future, and for Luca, that was a responsibility he was ready to take on. Luca Rinaldi walked back to his barracks after his meeting with Pope Robert, his mind filled with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. The Pope's offer had been unexpected, and for the first time in a long while, Luca found himself questioning what the future could hold. It wasn't just about protecting the Pope anymore. It was about being part of something bigger, something that could change the way the Vatican interacted with the world. As he entered the barracks, his fellow guards noticed the thoughtful expression on his face. They had always seen him as a quiet, focused member of the team, someone who never let emotions interfere with his duties. But tonight, Luca was different. "Everything okay, Luca?" one of the guards asked as they sat down at a table nearby. Luca paused for a moment, considering whether to share the news, but he realized there was no reason to hide it. The offer Pope Robert had made wasn't just a personal matter. It was something that could affect everyone in the Swiss Guard. "I just had a meeting with the Pope," Luca said quietly, still processing everything. "He wants me to take on a bigger role, not just as a guard, but as a representative of what the Vatican is becoming. He wants me to help lead a change in how we serve the people." The other guards exchanged glances, surprised. "That's big," another guard said. "What did you say?" Luca shrugged. "I told him I needed time to think about it." The room fell silent for a moment. Everyone knew the Pope was different, but it felt like a new era, one that could bring unexpected challenges. But it also felt like a chance to make a real difference, something none of them had expected. Later that night, Luca sat alone in his room, reading through the letter Pope Robert had sent him weeks earlier. The words still held the same weight. It wasn't just a note of sympathy. It had been a message of understanding, of compassion. Pope Robert hadn't simply seen Luca as a guard in uniform, but as a person who deserved to be heard, to be seen. As Luca thought about the role the Pope wanted him to take on, he realized something important. This wasn't about him climbing the ranks or gaining more power. It was about leading with humility, about showing others that their faith and their well-being mattered. The next morning, Luca made his decision. He walked to Pope Robert's office, where he was greeted by the same aide who had escorted him the night before. "Luca, Your Holiness is expecting you," the aide said, opening the door. Pope Robert was sitting at his desk, but this time there was a sense of calm determination in his demeanor. He looked up as Luca entered. "Have you made your decision?" the Pope asked. Luca nodded. "I have. I'm ready to take on the role you offered me. I believe in the change you want to create, and I want to be a part of it." Pope Robert smiled warmly. "I knew you would make the right choice. Together, we will make sure that the Vatican stands for something more than just tradition. It stands for service, for compassion, for a new kind of leadership." Luca felt a sense of purpose settle within him. He wasn't just a guard anymore. He was part of a movement, one that was about to reshape the way the Vatican served its people. As he walked out of the office, he knew that the path ahead would be challenging, but it would also be full of possibilities. For the first time in a long while, Luca felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be.